Kathryn, nice to see you.
Hello there. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course, as I often say, sometimes only you and I know the journey that we've taken to get to this particular recording. So, but I'll just leave it at that. Um,
Oh, that's okay. Well, we're here to talk about a book that's all about a journey, so perhaps it was fitting.
I think that that's clever. It's almost like you've done this before. That was an excellent segue. So, first off, I do want to say you're in a part of Britain, I guess, right? Is it Britain? I don't even
It
know.
is
See,
Britain.
it is Britain.
It's
See,
England, north of England, county of Yorkshire.
beautiful. And we've in a parallel universe, I might have asked you a ton of questions about that, but we'll just accept that as a very cool place to live. Um, and we want to jump in. You've actually published a number of books, but the first book, kind of the main big book from a publication standpoint, anyway, is The Things We Left Sleeping. And this book, as you mentioned, this book is a journey in and of itself. And as I sometimes say, in today's world, we have the left and the right of politics, and they kind of sometimes move far apart, sometimes close together, but they're definitely different pages of the same story. And you've taken that, has nothing to do with politics, but you've taken that idea and you've kind of done something very creative in this book. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. So my book's called The Things We Left Sleeping, and it's a literary fiction novel, but it's a story that's all about the journeys that we make out of grief and out of illness. And it contains lots of stories within it, but two main ones. And one of them occupies the left-hand side of the book. So when you open the book, we're going to have one narrative that runs down the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, you've got another narrative that runs down the right-hand side. And I know that sounds hideously complicated, but bear with me because I promise it's not when you open it. Because the left-hand side is all about a girl called Evie, and she wakes up in a strange place, and it's this mysterious farm where it's snowing all the time, and she doesn't really know what she's doing, and she has no control over her life. And then she finds a notebook and she starts writing in the notebook, and it starts off as word pictures and becomes sentences, and before long she's pretty much writing her world and writing what she's doing. And Evie's story is the story of what it's like to experience neurological illness, to experience neurological difference, and mental illness, because that's something that I myself have suffered with, and I wanted a way to really express what it's like to start off at your absolute lowest point, your point where you just feel like you have no voice, you have no autonomy and no control over your life, and literally find that journey, find that pathway back to a place where you have some sort of control and you really are your own voice and your own narrative. So that's happening on one half of the book. And in the other half of the book, we have the story of Evie's family, so of her partner, Stevie, and of her father as well. And what we're looking at is their journey through that situation. So how they cope as a family, how it affects them, how they try and help Evie, the problems that they have. So we have two sets of people journeying, trying to find solutions, but not really able to come back together. So as you read through the story, you're also physically experiencing in the book how they come apart, how they come together, and how they're trying to get to a place where these two narratives are resolved, and it's back to being one story again, which is the story of their family.
And you mentioned the details of this particular disease that's being depicted on the left hand side. I mean, it starts with the ability, or we have to come back from it. You have to relearn how to think, right, and how to
Um,
put thoughts together.
Absolutely. Well, it's a really difficult thing to describe. So if anyone's out there, who's listening, and they've experienced any kind of concussion or head injury, or any kind of illness that just really impacts their thought process, it can just absolutely feel like you have lost the ability to think, you've lost the ability to construct sentences, your speech can be affected, your sleep rhythms are affected, everything is affected. And what goes is your ability to communicate. And then what you have to communicate is your illness and your disease, because you've got doctors and neurologists and family asking you, what's wrong, how can we help, describe it. And what you've lost is the ability to describe, that illness. So what I was really trying to do was show why it's difficult, and why it's difficult is because you lose control over language. And for someone who's a writer, losing control over your language and your ability to express yourself and to, really have any kind of control over that narrative voice that we all have in our heads, that's a really hard thing. So Evie's side of the book, the narrator that's there, it's this really quite sinister challenging presence, because that is what your thoughts can feel like when you're experiencing a mental difference. Your own brain becomes really kind of hostile place in a hostile environment, and
Yeah,
that's
interesting.
where she
And
finds herself.
and I know this isn't a this isn't a biography or autobiography, whichever one. I mean, you're not writing, you're not in the book, but you've experienced some of the same things that the character experiences, right?
Exactly. So it's definitely not an autobiography, but it's a I would say it's a sort of purge. It's a purge of my experiences onto the page. It's a way of, so it's my frustrations with my illness. It's my experience of having seizures. It's my experience of what it's like to feel that frustration and that reconstruction. And it's definitely what I've observed about my family. So the sort of disjoint that happens between you and your family, and the impact that it has on family members, and the dependency that you have. So it's not my life story, but it's the story that I've written because of the experiences that I've had, and very definitely a place where I've chosen to put quite a lot of my own memories, fictionalized versions of my own memories, because I have such a problem with my own memory and with my own mind. So it's almost a safe depository of experiences, because that's perfectly okay. You can take real things and fictionalize them. You don't need any kind of permission to
Oh
do
yeah,
that. And I think it's
absolutely.
what a lot of writers do.
That's what I do. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, you gotta, I mean, I just like you, I'm not the characters in any of the books, but I know who they are as a person, and I know where they are. I know what they're going through, because you tend to draw from experiences. It must be what's so, what is the journey like looking back now to have written a book which is like the opposite of what this disease does to you? So I mean, it's the biggest middle finger you could ever give to this disease, right? Because it takes away your ability to organize, it sounds like. Yet you've organized this book, and it's not a simple book. You didn't just, now you wrote a book, Betty Goes Shopping. I mean, it's multi-layered. You can read it in different order. You can read the left side through, then you can read the right side through, you read them together. I mean, what does it feel like to be this far away from that, and to I don't want to say achieve, because that's not the right word, to have survived, to have learned and survived, to be able to do this.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. It feels very. It's like you've done something very, very exhausting, and you're just in that moment of relief at the end of it, because this isn't a linear book. It's not a book, as you said, that starts with Betty went shopping and then tells us what happened when Betty went to the shops and who she met. And because I wanted to be able to create something which is like life, because life isn't linear. We have things that are happening all over the place. We have things that are happening kind of all around us all the time. And one of the things that's very difficult, again, when you're going through an illness, is keeping track of things and keeping hold of things, and linking into the outside world. And it was something that I was really struggling with. I was just really, really struggling, I say, with organization, with names, with memory. I get lost a lot. I can't orientate myself. I can't organize myself. But looking at an empty page, what that actually gave me was the freedom to say, well, I don't have to write in a straight line. I don't have to even write in sentences. I can, just as Evie does in the book, I can create these word pictures and start my story from word pictures and build it up from there. So what Evie does in the book, with starting off with the word pictures and then constructing sentences and sort of defining words and playing with them, that's absolutely the way that I went about writing the book. So it was about not trying to get one over on the illnesses that I've got, and not trying to get rid of them because they're incurable, but very definitely about acknowledging what that illness has done, and then acknowledging the ways that you absolutely can cope with it and still achieve the things that you want to do. So it's a book that's almost a manual, really, a self manual of what I did to not get so much get out of the situations that I was in, but to be able to be all right with the situation that I was in, and get to a point where I could still do what I wanted to do.
Wow. So this book was written as part of some, and I really don't know the answer, but it's some kind of school effort, or this was like a final capstone for a degree, or what?
Absolutely. I mean, as you can tell from me describing it, it's not really the sort of book that I think that you would just sit down and write off the top of your head. I've been told it's very arty and things. I'm like, yes, it is very arty. It was part of a writing degree. So it's part of my MA in creative writing, which I did at Oxford Brookes. And to me, doing a writing degree was just so incredibly helpful, because I was struggling so much with so many things, and writing was one of the very few things that I had left that I felt capable of doing. And then to go somewhere where they actually help me with things like structure, with writing, and with techniques. And actually, they always say they can't teach you to write; they can only teach you techniques of how to write the way that you want to write. And so it was there that I realized lots of things about form and lots of things about function, and that actually I could write a book where there's lots of things happening all at once. Is absolutely nothing to stop me. What I can't write is something that's unintelligible. So that was what my MA really taught me, and that's what this project was all about. Was that I've got something that's very, very hard to describe. I can't describe it in a linear way. So how do I describe it? But also, how do I describe it in a way that actually works and that is accessible, and that people can in turn access? And just having tutors there who were able to say things like, well, okay, that's happening inside her head. What actually is happening in her family? How are you placing this? What's the time? What's the time that this is happening in? How old is that? Just having that feedback was really, really useful. And it started off as a very short piece that I did for a seminar, and it became my final project, so the equivalent of my thesis. So I handed in about the first quarter of it as my final project.
So did that, and I'm learning a lot about you as we talk. I mean, my impression is you're the kind of person, and I had this with my wife. The joke with my wife will say is, if I ask her not to do something, that's the only thing she'll do. So the big joke we have is we say a fork in the eye, which is, don't stick a fork in the eye. And then the joke is, if I'm going to go do it, the first thing I'm going to do. So I think you've got some of that in you. It seems to me like you've picked, this degree program, writing the book, the way you organize things, you're picking things that are hard, not easy. And I think that says something about your outlook and about the way that you've tackled things.
I think I got my illness when I was 24, so I just finished uni. I've been very successful. I love academia, so I was very successful at uni. I was at the start of really just enjoying my career, and I just absolutely got hit by this thing that completely incapacitated me. Ended up moving home. It's about the same time my mum died of cancer. She died within about 6 weeks of a diagnosis. So I just had this run of things that just absolutely hit me and absolutely floored me. I ended up living at home. I was completely dependent on my dad. I couldn't do anything for myself. I couldn't cook. I couldn't carry things. And it took me a long while to realize that I couldn't cure that, and that I could get better and I could go up and down and all that. But the only thing I could be was all right with myself. So if I can't sort of conquer my illness, what I can conquer is the feeling that it's completely inhibited my life. So it's not some challenges. It's a hard one, because you can't just set yourself a load of really hard challenges in the hope that proves something, because I'm now going to go out and do this, this, and this. But you also can't give up and do absolutely nothing. So it's a question of finding yourself those challenges that are things that actually you can be capable of doing, but you just need a little push to do them. So with things like the writing something that I love, it's something that I enjoy, and it's something that I've always wanted to do. And I'm like, well, if I've got very little energy and not a lot of time to do things during the week, what's the one thing I want to do? I want to write. So actually I'm going to write. I deserve to. I've got all this other stuff going on that's horrible and awful and I can't do anything about. So I choose to put what energy I have into this project, which was my MA. And I'm just going to choose to go at it and do that as absolutely hard as I can, because I'd rather go at one thing that I really want really, really hard than just use the illness as an excuse and just do several subpar things in a subpar way, because I sort of have an excuse to do that.
Right. Is the degree finished? It is.
It's finished. I have a certificate. It's all framed and on the wall.
Congratulations.
So,
Very good.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So I guess the book was a success in that that arena, but you went ahead and released it to the world. So and it's been out. It came out in April, so it's been out. How long is that? It's 6 months or so.
Yeah.
Has anything surprised you about the release of the book, and positive or negative, or disappointed you, or really made you happy, but just anything that you weren't expecting that happened as you got this thing out there in the public's eye?
I think one of the things that I really liked about it is the response that I've got from other people who are in similar situations. So I was at a wedding at the weekend and someone said, oh, your Liz's friend has written a book. What's your book about? So I was explaining it. And then just like, that's so interesting because I have a neurological condition and I've really struggled with a diagnosis and I've really struggled, and like my family has had all these problems and we've been dealing with this for years. And just the fact that, you know, you can write about something that's incredibly personal to yourself, but is absolutely relatable to other people. Other people don't have to have lived your life, but they can have shared your experience. And what I'm proud of in the book is that I've managed to write my experience, but make it so that it speaks to other people as well, so that, you know, they do actually say to me, is that I have a friend who's an occupational therapist and who works with the elderly, and she's the bit that's interesting to her, she said, is all of the case notes, because the book includes sort of fictionalized versions of the case notes. And she says that, you know, whenever she gets someone coming to the hospital who's just got this massive case file and she just feels like, oh my god, I've got to read all this case file, she remembers my book and sort of thinks, I need to read this case file because it's so important, because everything I need to know should be in here. So, you know, just the fact that it's something that's so incredibly personal to me, but there's actually so many people that it's also personal to as well. And that is such a positive thing to hear and a reassuring thing to hear. And so when you've written something that when you try and describe it and you say, I've got two narratives going and there's word pictures and there's medical notes and there's all this, it sounds really complicated. You know, I've actually managed to make it accessible, and that's what I wanted. I wanted what was going on inside my head to become accessible, so that I could finally explain, you know, what was going on in here.
I think I like irony. I will sometimes say irony is funny. I don't mean it like it's a joke funny, but it's ironically funny. I will take something from our conversation away, which is, you said part of the challenge with this disease is it's hard for the person to be able to explain how they feel, what's going on, and the only thing that the people want to talk to them about is how they feel and what's going on, including the doctors, right? That's the only conversation they can have. But it's the thing that this thing attacks. So I can project how I would feel. It just feels very frustrating. It's on top of everything else. So that's interesting. So, you know, the book, there's a lot of meta advice in this, but let's say you wanted to give advice, you had the chance to give advice to someone who was gonna write a book about a different type of experience, but one just as personal and just as difficult as the one that you've captured here. What advice might you have for them?
My advice would be, don't listen to people's writing advice. And I know that sounds really corny thing to say, but like people say things like, oh, you know, you should sit down every day and you should write so much and you should just keep on writing and you shouldn't look back and you shouldn't revise. When I was writing this book, I would sometimes, I cannot go forward until the bit that I've written is correct, because to me, things happen because of what I've already written. So if things have happened and I've not written them correctly, they can't have the correct consequence going forward. So for me, writing is a process where I write and then revise and write and then revise and write and then revise. So the book is completely rewriting itself all the time, because I can't go forward. My characters can't move forward if something hasn't happened to them correctly to get them to that spot. And although you might think, oh no, I'll go back and change that later, to me that's a barrier, because I'm too busy thinking I've got to go back and change that later, I've got to go back and change that later. So if you want to write one paragraph and get it perfect, you've not done less than someone who's written 20 imperfect paragraphs that they're going to fix later. Find a way that absolutely works for you, and you can write a little bit every day, or you can sit down and write solidly for a week. And again, there's no right or wrong. So any of this advice, which is you have to do this and you have to write so much, and you know, these people that said, you know, don't close your document, always open it up and always go to the last point, if that doesn't work for you, don't do that. Do whatever works for you, because as I say, for me it's exactly the opposite, and I've got to get things right, because to me the people in chapter 10 can't be living with a completely fictionalized chapter 4 that's never actually going to happen to them. It has to happen in sequence, else all I get in my head is a lot of characters complaining that actually never happened and they didn't say that.
Yeah, no, that advice for me, it works. Some of the things you don't agree with, I do, and some of the things that you do, I do too. But it's the thing we both share. I can't know exactly what you said. I can't know that I said the door was locked in chapter 4 and then need it to be unlocked in chapter 10 and just hope I remember and keep right. I can't do it. I can't, because to your point, the future can't exist unless I clean that up. So I've got to go back, and I write the same way, which is it's what I'm just repeating what you just said. It's the same thing, which is I'm constantly going back and combing and combing and combing, so that as I'm writing, page 300, all the pages leading up to it lead up to that page 300, and that's how I do it. And I've had a lot of success doing it that way. The advice you typically get, which is what you said, which is, oh, just get on the page. It was just terrible for me. It was awful. I couldn't think. I didn't really know what was going on. It was
and I think it's because you're trying to hold too many pasts in your head, and how can your characters resolve their future if they've got about 10 pasts going on? It's impossible. So that would be my advice. Find the way that works, that absolutely works for you. And if you're not doing what some writing advice tells you to do, it really doesn't matter. What the important thing is that you write and you are pleased with what you have written, and you don't want to change it.
Yeah, that's right. And if you can do that, and then you get it released, and even if you get criticized, you're comfortable with it. And that there's a big difference between being comfortable with what you put out and then listening to the criticism, and having rushed it, or not being comfortable with you put out, knowing that the criticism is something is true. All criticism is true, but it's true in a way that could have been avoided, or you feel like a failure, or whatever that word is. So.
Exactly. I mean, and you are going to get criticism on your book. It is going to happen, and it's going to happen from your editors. It's going to happen from your proofreaders. I remember that, like, when it had been through about 2 or 3 editors, I gave it to my dad, and I'm like, Dad, can you just read this? And he came back with some pages that is highlighted because I got mistakes, and I'm like, what do you mean they're wrong? What do you mean? And I got really, really defensive. And it's like, well, you asked me to read it, and I was like, oh yeah. So I did. You're gonna get criticism, and it's not because you're wrong necessarily. It's because somebody who's not you, and who hasn't had all of those 20 revisions in their head has spotted something. And for me, the less I've had to go back and revise as I go, the less of those little niggling mistakes they're going to be, because the more you call, the neater the story.
Yeah. And by the way, I say most of my criticism comes from the people who read it and then throw it at me. So but those are my books, not your books. So your books are good. All right, Kathryn. Well, look, it's been a pleasure talking to you. And are you working on another big book like this one?
Not one like this one, but yeah, I've got a few other things. I've got what we call I can never remember what they call them these days, but like a younger adult fiction, young adult fiction.
Young adult, that's
the words popular. I'm searching for. And I've got a book of short stories which is already out. I've got a little mental health picture book for your Kindle. So I've got a few different things on the go. Okay.
Well, look, this is The Things We Left Sleeping. It's a very fascinating, interesting book. I think it's worth reading. And I wish you much success with it. And when you get another book out, let me know and we'll have another chat.
Thank you very much for having me. And thank you to everyone who's listened right to the end. Well done.
Thank you. All right, bye.
Thank you for watching. Please consider hitting the subscribe button.